So Stanley Parable is a cool little game. After talking about Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, I figured I would talk about this one. It sort of kind of fits into the category I had in mind at the time, which is like a short story game, a game that's the gaming equivalent of a short story for like a book or a film, like a short film, short novel. So the introduction, the Stanley Parable is based on a source mod of the same name that was made a long time ago, and this now is like an HD remix of it with some more content as well. The basic point of the game, it's a first person shooter exploration game, kind of like Dear Esther, kind of like Gone Home. Yeah, and it thematically and structurally it coincides with those games as well. But personally, I'd say it's better than the two of those. The basic mechanics, you would include walking and looking around and pressing buttons for the most part. The point of the game in general, as you probably know, as you probably heard, is it's an examinations of tropes, specifically a do with narrative choice in video games, right? That's what the game is generally about. The closest equivalent to that in another medium I can think of is something like Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is a comic book about comic books. Like, the comic book itself, like, if you haven't read it, you probably should. It's a really good work of fiction, as well as an explanation of how the comic book medium actually works. But the book, it has like a main character who's drawn, and he talks about the tropes within comic books, and he sort of narrates, what they're like and explains them to you, and, he talks about comic books in general. It's a very good little book, but it's pretty long. It's a lot longer than Stanley Parable, like, comparatively, because it truly sort of tries to analyze the tropes, whereas Stanley Parable just sort of makes fun of them, which has its own merit, obviously. So, yeah, I'm going to start with the non-spoiler set of doing a game, because this isn't a game at the end of it. Like, it's not really a game. If you look at, like, Total Biscuit, when he described Stanley Parable, he says, "This is my favorite, the best non-game I have ever played." It's hardly a game, it's more of a metagame. It's a game about a game, just like Understanding Comics is a comic book about comic books. Right, so the basic mechanics, just moving around, pressing buttons. You have, you have choices. You have narration, which is 90% of the content is what the narrator actually says, and he makes commentary on what you do as the player. So it creates this very like humorous, dramatic irony sort of form of appeal, where the developers, through the writing, are actually speaking directly to you as a player and trying to communicate some sort of, it's like an inside joke happening over and over and over again. It's really kind of neat. This is the type of game you would genuinely enjoy. You would only really enjoy it if you truly enjoyed gaming as a whole. If you thought of gaming as, well, actually that's not true. No, it's not true. Journey is a game that you would only like, literally you would only enjoy Journey if you firmly believed in the notion that gaming was art. If you believe that gaming was art, you would love Journey. Stanley Parable is more palatable than something like Journey, or Dear Esther as well. Dear Esther is a game you would only ever like if you accepted the fundamental philosophy that gaming is art. If you don't, then stuff like Dear Esther and Journey would just go way right over your head. Stanley Parable is more palatable because the jokes that they make are actually would relate to most gamers, I'd say. Even most gamers that don't think about gaming as art, because even they are somewhat familiar with what choice is in gaming, I think. So there is that. One thing I want to say about the narrator as well is that the fact that he has an English accent, pretty much a work of genius. I never played the original Half-Life 2 mod. I'm not actually sure, the source mod. I'm not sure how the narrations work in that, or even if they have narrations, or how exactly that thing worked. I know this game has more content, I'm not sure how that one worked or if it had the same appeal. I'm going to talk, exclusively about this game. And I want to say the narration here specifically. The fact that the guy has an English accent adds a lot to it because, for whatever reason, a person having an English accent automatically gives them this sort of sense of like eloquence and refinement that makes a lot of sense when we're talking about sort of narrative and writing in this high, sort of intellectual, high-octane stuff, right? So it makes a lot of sense that the guy has an English accent. Furthermore, when your guy has an English accent, if he complains about something that you do, and he complains about stuff that you, the character, does, well, it's very amusing to hear how he complains, because the guy has an English accent. It's almost impossible to take him seriously because of how, this could be something that I'm just like, that I'm just reading into it, but my point is, if this was a guy with like a regular accent from New York or whatever, it would not have the same appeal. It wouldn't seem as like as zany as like this sort of very witty British humor that ends up happening because the guy has a British accent. I mean, that's just how I feel. Like, if he didn't have a British accent, a lot would be taken away from the work, I think. So that's a definite bonus, I'd say. The writing in the game is spectacular. The actual, like, all the writing in this game, the only interaction that ever happens is from the narrator himself. All the words come from him. He's the only voice you hear. And what he actually says is pretty brilliant, because the whole game is about him making comments about what you actually do, and whether the comments he makes, both in terms of reflecting on what the character does in a sort of, in like an abstract, metagamey way, like the meaning of choice and the trope of choice, and trying to examine that stuff's really good. And what's also really good is the humor, which is, I've already talked about it, but it's like the wittiness of the inside jokey wittiness of the fact that the narrator knows you're in a game and you know you're in a game, so the game is sort of self-aware that it's a game. It's a very self-aware game as well, like Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, I should say. Right, but I'm gonna say, like, I can't even go further without really talking about particular spoilers, because anything in this game could be thought of as a spoiler. Any narration is a spoiler. Any little bit of content you could think of as a spoiler. It's not a huge spoiler because it's not really a story game, right? The game isn't about telling you some epic tale of anything. It's just, it's about, right, it's not about what's being told, it's about how it's being told. It's about the experience and the, my point is, I'm going to put the spoiler warning down right here, but I'm just going to say that this isn't the type of spoiler warning that should deter people necessarily. Listen to the narration and watch what happens and feel the exact same way, and not feel like you've lost on anything by knowing what's going to happen and knowing some sort of catch, right? Because, I mean, just trust me. So, yeah, anything, pretty much, I'm going to say right now, everything from this point forward, I will talk about specific content within the game and the stuff the narrator says and the stuff that you have and the stuff that you will experience, but let it be known that I do not think that this takes away from your experience if you haven't played this game. This is not a game like Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons where I could ruin the experience by telling you what happens at the end. Not like that at all. So just go with me here and keep watching. So the game has like 23 different endings. It depends what you mean by an ending. There are 10-ish, 10 I think, quasi-endings or Easter eggs that aren't exactly endings but sort of force you to restart the game anyway. And Easter eggs are always really cool. I like a game that does Easter eggs because it sort of shows that the developers actually cared about what they were trying to do. They cared enough to actually make a joke of it as well and have this, like a hidden gem or whatever that you could find if you're really a dedicated player. So there's 10 Easter eggs. Some of these don't actually make much sense. For instance, there's... Alright, so there's like the weird disco that happens within the surveillance room, where if you sit around long enough, which is just there like for no reason at all, it's just there for the lulls. And that stuff's fine. That stuff's cute. You know, I enjoy it. There's the if you type face punch into the console, the colors get reversed throughout the entire game, which is like its own Easter egg. There's the part where with Portal in the game's ending, you could actually lock yourself and prevent yourself from passing through it by it's not a glitch. You can actually you can lock yourself in Portal. I forget how you actually do it. I think it's by bringing the cube through the door or something like that. But the point is, if you do this, the narrator actually comments on it, and he says, "Oh, look, you've sequence broken. You can't, go through the game now. So I'm just going to keep you locked in here. You're going to have to restart." And he actually says this to you, and you will be forced to sit there indefinitely. You actually can't finish the game. You will have to click I'm in it. The point is, there's this inherent aspect to it where the joke of the game is the fact that you are constantly going to have to restart to see what jokes they have made within the game. And the game actually, and this is one of the jokes that the game actually does, because like the Portal 2 failing, when you fail the Portal there's a Portal puzzle in the game, right? And if you fail it, the narrator said, like I explained, he will comment on it. So the fact that that fact demonstrates that the game is aware of the fact that you are playing the game in order to constantly restart it and look at all the endings, right? To see what tropes and what jokes this game has to offer. And the game knows this because it's self-aware, and it makes fun of the fact by forcing you to do it if you do something wrong. And that's just, it's hilarious that that's how it works. It's again, these little cute little touches. This entire game is about that sort of comedy, not as so much commentary as much as comedy. Well, there's commentary as well. Another Easter egg, right, is the out of map ending. I didn't even realize this at first when I started the game. I'm fairly thorough in exploration games. I sort of like to look around a lot and make sure I don't lose out on any detail. And right within the very first room, if you go up towards one of the desks, you sort of glitch walk on top of the desk, like you're suddenly on top of the desk, as before you'd be walking below it. Like there's a platform that let you walk up the desk, right? And I thought, okay, this is just a mistake. This is something the developers they left some geometry there or whatever that allowed me to get on top of the desk. Turns out this was intentional, and what you're actually supposed to do is get on top of the desk and then walk over towards a window nearby and walk through it. And through the window, what you're in is then you're in a square white room that's supposed to look like the exterior of the window, like bright light. And the narrator comes to you and says, "Oh, look at that. This was actually part of the game. Isn't this awesome? Isn't this cute?" And it's a whole joke about that as well. And that's hilarious. Again, this is like a demonstration of the game being self-aware. A trope, like the trope here, is obviously the trope that games will sometimes forget, that you can clip or exploit or use a bug to exit the game playing area into an area where you're not actually supposed to be, an out of map sort of thing. And this game does that as well. Not only that, but after it does it, it asks you a question whether or not you enjoy the gag, and if you say yes or something like that. But actually no. I think what happens is that I finished the game like a month ago, so I don't remember all the details, but one of the things that happens was he starts playing a lot of music, and if you get bored of the music, you could say that I don't like the music, and he stops playing the music, and you're just stuck there in the white, because you can't get back up to the window because you fell out, and continue playing the game. And if you say that you don't want the music to stop playing, then it'll just keep playing indefinitely, and you'll just have to sit there. Again, this is another example of where the game forces you to restart, otherwise you will just sit there indefinitely because there's nothing else to do. The game, and honestly, the game being short is pretty nice then. You don't want a game to be long and have, saves if sequence breaks are allowed. This game has sequence breaks because it comments on the sequence breaks, So that's why that type of stuff, it's okay because the game is actually short, and the longest ending you can run through it in a half hour and, you know, be absolutely fine. So that stuff's cool. What other Easter eggs there are? So, okay, right. There's the serious ending where if you type in SV_cheats1 in the console, you get teleported to a room where the narrator will berate you for saying how you need to be like disciplined, or you're not serious enough, you're trying to use cheats. Again, hilarious, the trope being that players will use cheats if a game is hard or something to that effect. It's that whole gag thing continued. So what else? I wrote everything down because I couldn't like remember all the little details. Okay. Right, the out of map ending I talked about. The heaven ending. I don't know if you even found this, but I imagine some people did. The heaven ending, there are computers within the game that have these like purple bar, and each time you restart the game, you can find one of these computers within the game and, you know, press the button, click on it, right, or press the use button, and the purple bar will fill. And once it fills all the way, and this takes several playthroughs, several replays, right, to fill the purple bar completely, then when you restart the game again, you have the purple bar on your computer within Stanley's office, and if you press that, then you get teleported to heaven, which is just like this white room with like bright lights and a ring of buttons going around and around Stanley, floating like a ring of colorful buttons. The joke being that Stanley likes to press buttons. I actually didn't talk about Stanley at all. Sorry. Stanley is an employee of a company, and his role is to press buttons. And then all of a sudden he wakes up one day and all his co-workers, his bosses, everyone is just gone, disappeared. And you don't know what's happening, and you have to go find out. And as you go find out, you find out that it's actually all nonsense. This is just like a story being written by the narrator, something to that effect, right? So yeah, the button Easter egg, or the button ending, again, you can only leave it by restarting the game. By hitting escape and then clicking restart, is just the joke of the fact that Stanley likes to press buttons, which is an inside joke, again, because the fact that as a player, the only thing you really do is you press buttons, right? That's sort of a meta joke as well, because it's not just a joke about Stanley or player choice, it's a joke about gaming in general, how you're always just the button presser. In any game you play, you are literally a button presser, right? So that's really cool. I like the fact that, again, I like the fact that the game's very self-aware about all this stuff and openly explores it. Right, what else? Okay, so one of the funniest Easter eggs, I just want to talk about all the Easter eggs first. The funniest Easter egg is the closet Easter egg. If you go down one of the paths, there is a broom closet, and if you go into the broom closet, the narrator will comment on the fact that you're in the broom closet. And if you stay in the broom closet, he will keep commenting on it, and he will get mad at you and get irritated and start insulting you, and it's just the funniest thing ever. The first time I played the game, the very first time I played it, I saw the broom closet open, and I'm like, I'm going into that broom closet. I want to see what's in there. And he started commenting, and I'm like, you know what? Given the tone of this game, I'm going to sit here and see if he says anything more. And he kept saying more stuff, and it was just the funniest thing ever. Not only that, but on a subsequent playthrough, if you go past the broom closet and it's open and you go in there again, the narrator, he will make a comment that, oh god damn it, you're in the broom closet again, why are you there? As if you've already been there, because he's aware of the fact that you were there on the first playthrough, right? Because the game sort of, there's all these like, the game keeps track of your progression for all the different endings, so it can keep track of, so it can add on content like this by knowing what content you've done before. And the third playthrough, if you go down that path, the broom closet is actually locked and bolted with a bunch of pieces of wood so that you can't go in there, which is hilarious. Is to think that the narrator forced the closet shut so that you would not be diverted by that. So happy that they put that in. Even when you're in the broom closet, he's talking about like, ooh, you're probably gonna go talk to your friends and say you got the broom closet ending. The broom closet ending was my favorite. I'm sorry for that English accent. That was probably horrible. But he says, yes, the broom closet ending was my favorite, and he just makes fun of you, and it's the funniest thing in the world. And again, the trope here is that sometimes gamers don't actually, sometimes they screw around. Sometimes they don't actually follow the story, they just want to go sit there, do their own thing, which is pretty fun to do. And very cute approach. So, I guess I could talk about the regular ending, the normal one, or I guess I could start talking about actual endings. So Stanley, as I've already said, the main story, the official story, is that he's at work, all of his coworkers and bosses suddenly disappear, there's nothing but papers on the ground, his room is unlocked, he has to go find out what's happening. And he goes down, and then the narrator is describing what you're doing this entire time. And within 20 seconds, you reach a room where there's 2 doors. And this is the first choice. This is the first big choice in the game that affects... Okay, first of all, let me backtrack. There's the first choice you make is leaving the room. Because if you stay in the room where you start out, the room that Stanley was initially in, that itself is an ending. Eventually the room closes, and then Stanley dies, and you have to restart, because that's like the coward ending, or it's called something to that effect. The joke there being, again, that sometimes as a player you have a choice of not going anywhere and not progressing through the game, and in this game that actually counts as being part of the game, because they add content and dialogue, and the narrator will say stuff if you actually just stay still. So that's really cool. Yeah, I think that was actually the first ending I got, was the coward ending. So the normal ending is you pretty much go through all the rooms and you do exactly what the narrator says you do. When you get to the first big choice, is you're in a room and there's 2 doors. There's a door on the left and the right, and the narrator says, Stanley went through the door on the left. You can go through the door on the right, and it leads to a whole bunch of other endings. You can go through the door on the left, there's a bunch of endings, and this is intentionally the part of the game where you start to make choices, and depending on which endings you take, the narrator will berate you for the choices you've made, and he will, and through the sort of the narrative and the dialogue, the choices you made will be sort of examined. The very idea of choice is examined. If you go down the regular path, do everything the narrator says, it's probably the most boring ending of them all, because no choice gets examined. Pretty much what happens is you go down the left door, then through the bus, then through some meeting room, then up the stairs to his boss's office. Stanley's boss is missing. He goes through some door in his boss's office down to a secret mind control facility where there's all these screens on the walls. He goes through that to some room where he gets to shut down the mind control facility. He shuts down the mind control facility, then the facility opens up and he walks away into like nature. And that's the end of the story, and that's the end of the game. And this is the only path where the narrator doesn't explicitly comment on what you're doing, I'm pretty sure. Actually, yeah, it's sure. Because this is the only path where the narrator sort of talks about Stanley like a third person. Like, Stanley did this, Stanley did that, Stanley did all this stuff. He doesn't actually berate you for any choices. He doesn't talk about why you're doing certain things. There's no examination. This is literally what the typical story is in games or in general. It's that there's a narrator who says, oh, this is what happens, and that's exactly what happens. It's linear, and that's it. Right? So that ending is there just because it has to be there. This is the standard game, right? This is the standard story. The alternative to it is if at the very end, instead of shutting down the mind control facility, you choose to boot it up. And here the narrator gets really, really mad at you. He starts berating you, yelling at you, and he says, you know what? Screw you, I'm going to blow everything up. Because he's the narrator, it's his story. He can do whatever it is that he wants, right? And so right before the mind control facility, like, shutdown room, there's this room with all these different buttons and shit, and it's like there's this massive screen with a timer that says, you know, countdown to self-destruction, and it's like 2 minutes or whatever, and you're thinking, oh, maybe there's a code, I can stop it, and there's all these buttons to press, there's something to figure out. There's no pattern, there's no code, there's nothing. No matter what you do, if you chose to boot up the mind control facility, you will die after the whole thing explodes. The point of it alone is just the commentary that the narrator's choosing to punish you for not following through with his story, which is pretty hilarious in its own way. I'm not sure what this ending comments on. I mean, I guess it's like, it's kind of the thing where it's commentary on the fact that a game will punish you if perhaps necessarily you don't do what the ideal story arc is supposed to be. I'm not sure. Or it's just the idea of, you know, let's punish the player by for making a choice, right? Why not? Let's punish the player for making a choice. Let's kill the player off. Let's, you know, sort of destroy them. Oh, actually, another thing is that the explosion this is the explosion ending. What it does is it actually, it also makes fun of endings in games where whenever there's a sort of dire situation like this, like there's a countdown or something, there's always a very simple solution, and all you have to do is just like figure out the code, right, or press the buttons. But here there's all these buttons and shit that are meant to sort of divert you and make you think that maybe there's a way to get out of this. There's actually no way to get out of it, though. It's literally meant to kill you. And all those buttons that are in the room, they're just there to confuse you while the countdown is happening. So the joke there is that I guess in games there's this fundamental assumption in gaming how there's always supposed to be a way out, and here there's no way out. That's the joke, right? Right, let's talk about the escape pod ending. The escape pod ending is cool, because if you go to the boss's office, and then as you walk into the boss's office, it takes a second for the doors behind you to close, and if you back out through the doors before they close, the doors close in front of you, you can't actually proceed, you know, via the narrative arc that starts when you enter the boss's office, which is you go down to the mind control facility and all this other stuff with the explosion and just the normal ending, right? So it's cool because it's like the game breaks. You know, this is the game making fun of an exploit. The game has broken because you backed out through these doors that you weren't supposed to back out through. This wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to keep going forward, right? So the game breaks. In fact, the narration that starts happening as soon as you enter the boss's office is cut off. Like, legitimately, the audio is cut off as soon as the doors close, as soon as you back out and the doors close, thereby emphasizing that the game, it's like you broke the game. Turns out, though, you didn't break the game, because if you backtrack through to the very beginning where Stanley's office is, there's a hidden door that's now open that leads to, it says, that you and the narrator both need to be there in order for the escape pod to work, and the escape pod is you're supposed to, like, escape the story. But because the narrator's not there, the escape pod, you just restart the story. And the narrator's not there because you broke him by backing out through the door. It's just, it's a really cool feature because the game makes fun of itself to the point that it actually has an ending. It actually has a narrative and an ending for supposedly breaking the game. Okay? Breaking the game in this game is part of the game. Right? It's like, it's meta to the umpteenth degree because you don't even break the game by breaking the game. Anyway, yeah, the point of the escape pod ending was to convince you that you had broken the game when in fact you hadn't broken the game, because what was happening was they were making fun of the fact that in some games you can break the game and that would be the end of it. In this game, you break the game and that leads to a whole other ending. That shit is cool, right? What other endings do we have? Insane ending. So the insane ending was actually okay, well, after the coward ending, the insane ending was the first ending I got. I got to that staircase where he says, Stanley went up the stairs to his boss's office. I went down the stairs because I'm like, I'm not going to listen to you, you know, a second time. And I went down the stairs, and this was cool because I hadn't actually talked about this game, but this game does some really cool, like weird visual stuff where you're sort of, you'd be walking in a circle, but the place you were walking from is no longer there. Like, how do you describe them? Like, sort of like visual illusions type of thing, because when you go down the insane ending, you're in the parking lot and you're walking through the rooms, but what ends up happening is you're actually walking in a circle. You walk through the same rooms over and over and over again. I don't recall, like from a coding perspective, I don't actually know how it works. I don't know if they're recycling the same, like if as the player character is being teleported to the beginning of each room when he gets to the end of it over and over and over again, or if there's literally like a circle within the geometry of the game that you're going through. It's kind of cool. It's like what Portal does, where you can see an entire room and then you can look through a portal and see the exact same room from another angle, and there's these weird like visual effects where you have like infinite loops if you have one portal like along the same axis, right? So that stuff is really, really interesting. This isn't a direct, this ending isn't a direct example of that, but it's like it's one of the first, because you descend into this lobby and then you're walking in a circle over and over and over again. And then what ends up happening is that the narrator basically starts talking about, he starts like undermining everything that Stanley is. It's a very bizarre ending. The point of this ending, the idea, the trope that they're sort of targeting is the idea of, I mean, it's the idea of the idea. It's the idea of what a player character is in a way. They didn't do too much of this, but it's, yeah, the trope here is the idea of the player character and why the player character is special and who the player character is. Like, the narrator starts talking about the fact that Stanley is hearing a narrator in his head who's talking about all this weird stuff that he's going through. And I can't actually, like, it's hard to explain, but he's talking about how everything that you've done so far in the game as you get to the insane ending is something that Stanley as a person would be concerned about. Like, oh, why am I walking through the same rooms over and over again? Why do I hear a voice in my head narrating my every thought and my every action? Why do I have no legs when I look down? And then he's like floating in the air and stuff and walking through space, and it's like, it's really weird stuff, and it doesn't end, and eventually Stanley goes insane and he dies, and then the narrator starts talking about some woman named Mariella who finds his body. It's weird because this ending kind of like, it's a sort of, it makes some amount of sense, right? Like the normal ending where there's actually like an ending, like you destroy the mind control facility. The endings that don't make sense are endings where the narrator directly interacts with the player character, with you, and says, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? This is an ending where that doesn't happen, technically, because the narrator doesn't actually interact with you. Or Stanley, he sort of just narrates what Stanley's thinking, then Stanley dies, and then he's like, oh yeah, but Mariella finds him, and that's like its own story. It's a really weird one. I would say that the point of this ending in general was to comment on the idea of what the player character sort of means and what the player character is about, and if the player character were an actual human being, were an actual like person, a character, they would question a lot of the stuff that they do within games because their actions are not their own, right? They're being controlled by a person in real life, right? What else do we have? We have the museum ending. Okay. So, okay, there's the in control ending first. The in control ending is if you go down the door on the right and you get onto the forklift and then you back off at the last second and then you jump off over the edge. You just simply die. The reason it's its own ending is because there's some extra narration if you decide to do this. That's about it. There's like some weird narrations if you jump off. The narrator says like, oh, Stanley thought that he was in control, but it turns out he wasn't. The museum ending is if you go down to the mind control facility, there's an alternate path that says escape, and if you go down this alternate path, you're about to get grinded into like a pulp by some machine, and the narrator tries to stop you, but he fails, and what happens is the machine actually fails to work, and you get transported to a white museum, and all of a sudden a female narrator shows up and she starts narrating your actions and she makes fun of both you and the other narrator. So it's like, it's like the whole Matrix thing where there's like a reality within a reality within a reality. Like the narrator obviously is another character, right? He's another character designed by, you know, some the designers, right? But the point is that he is as much a product of this fictional video game world as we are. So that's to be taken into account. The museum itself is just a museum to all the other stuff in the game, where they show you like diagrams and pictures and concept art and all the little puzzles they came up with, and you know, basically all the assets of the game and how that stuff came together. It's a pretty cool little thing. I didn't explore too much of it, but there's definitely some time you could spend there looking at all the different stuff that's there. And there's little like miniatures of the gaming path, of your path through the office to the double door where you get to make your first choice. So, you know, if you want to explore a game, the game is about itself, right? So it's very fitting that there's a museum for the game within the game, because, you know, it's all like the intro screen to this game is like, it's the screen, and then within the screen, on the screen there's a computer, and on the computer there's another screen, which is the screen that you're looking at, like at overall. So it's like this fractal. It keeps like zooming in, right? Because you have the screen, and the computer has the same screen on it, and then on that screen there's a computer that has the same screen on it, and so on and so forth. And this is another aspect of that. It's the fact that, you know, there's a museum to the game within the game. And after you leave the museum, what is it? The female, like, you just die and you have to restart. Because, whatever, that's the gist here, right? So, okay. Then we have all the stuff with the phone ending. The phone leads to two different endings. You can unplug the phone, or you can answer the phone. If you answer the phone... Okay, so let me back up. If you go through the door on the right and you go up the forklift, you get taken to a room where there's a phone, where the narrator says your girlfriend's calling you or your wife is calling you. You answer the phone, she picks up, you're transported to your house. This ending, however, is a massive, massive joke, because it turns out your wife is actually a mannequin, and the room you're in is actually looks suspiciously like your office, and if you stay there, the narrator will insult you. He will insult everything you are, and then he'll tell you to press buttons, and you will press buttons, and the room will slowly reconstruct itself back to Stanley's original office where you start the game off to begin with, and this is how it ends. And the game... So the narrator tells you that you have to press buttons, right? If you don't press buttons, the game literally does not advance. It does this a lot, like I've already pointed out, but it does this thing where there's something you don't necessarily want to do, but you have to do it anyway because the game won't advance if you don't do it. This ending makes fun of that. It also makes fun of the fact by suggesting that everything that Stanley's going through is his own sort of imagination that he came up with, because his life is really boring, because all he does is he sits down and he presses buttons on a computer keyboard. Like, that's his whole life. This is a subversion of that trope, because what they're trying to say is this is almost sort of making fun of the type of story where a character's the arc that happens within the story, the narrative, is the character's imagination, because the character's real life is dull. This ending makes fun of that trope where a character's story is his imagination, right? The character's story is inside his head. This ending makes fun of that, I think. That was my interpretation of it. Again, it's kind of cool because there's this whole inside joke happening with the audience, because they mention the button pressing thing again, and the button pressers and all this stuff is us. It's the audience, it's the players, not Stanley on his own, right? The other phone ending, if you unplug the phone, is narrative contradiction. And this one really confused me at first, because it's like pretty much what happens is random objects stop showing up all over the place, and the narrator gets really pissed off at you because it's like you broke his story. And if he transports you back to the original room with the two doors, and if you go through the right door, the whole room is like destroyed and it's like distorted, and there's like furniture toppled over and it's all like breaking down. The joke, I mean, the point of this ending is to say that you have destroyed the story by making a narrative contradiction, by choosing to do something that the narrator, who's the story's creator, didn't want you to do. You did something that he didn't want you to do, and as a result, the story is broken. The reason you did something he didn't want you to do is because you aren't actually Stanley, you're a player, and this is actually mentioned in this ending, where the narrator explicitly points to the fact where it's like, wait, you aren't Stanley, you're someone else. Oh, there's also that weird video where they sent you about the importance of choice or something, and it's done in that weird, like, Bioshock 1-esque sort of intro video fashion. I don't exactly remember the details of that one, but it was really funny. So yeah, there's this whole meta aspect to that. Again, this is the type of situation where the narrator is himself a writer of the story, but at the same time he's not, right? Because he's also a product of it. Because he's not a writer, he's a component. The writers were the people who made it. He's a component, but he acts like a writer because the game is about writing a story. So he gets mad at the player character. He gets mad at the player, rather, not just the player character. He gets mad at the player for making a narrative contradiction within his story, within a game. It like really, it's like, this meta stuff really confuses the mind, I'll say. It's really like, it makes my brain hurt in a way, but it's hilarious and it's really fun to look at. It's really like cool. What other endings we have? So we also have the confusion ending. The confusion ending, I think, is my favorite because of the whole visual aspect I already mentioned. There's parts of the confusion ending is when you start to follow the yellow line, where there's like, if you follow it to understand it. If you play the insanity ending, the confusion ending, I'd say follow the line to a letter. Do not ever like leave the line. I mean, I'm pretty sure you sort of make you follow the line, but there's a really cool like bit there, especially where, like I said, it's like, I can't explain it. God damn it! It's like, if you follow the line, continue, it'll seem like one straight path. But if you don't follow the line, if you sort of look as to where the line goes, it goes through a place that it shouldn't visually. Like it looks like there's like these lockers. It looks like it should just weave between them, but as it weaves between like these two lockers here, it weaves between them right there. Right this section here where it goes between lockers, it goes down a massive hallway. It goes down a massive hallway. If you follow the line, you will walk down this massive hallway and experience this hallway. But if you keep walking forward, the line just appears here as if it's just in this room with lockers in it, right? Understand? So that was really, really cool. The confusion ending is another one of the endings where the narrator is not actually in control of the story. He's like, wait, this is an actual ending? As you get to the end of it, I love his like commentary. He's like, wait, are you telling me this is supposed to be an actual ending where you get confused? Because the ending here, the idea here is that the narrator himself didn't know how to make the story work, and so he got confused, and so everything sort of went to shit. And the game constantly has to restart because you understand that the narrator doesn't actually know how to complete the story or where for the story to go. Again, meta commentary all over the place. A narrator or the writer not knowing where the story to go is, alright, whatever, and it manifests itself within the Stanley Parable sort of existence verse via this confusion ending path where the story is constantly restarted or rewritten because the writer wants to rewrite it, but they keep doing it wrong, and it's just ridiculous. The idea of the adventure line also, it's just like, there's this line that you follow that takes you down a path with a story, and there's an adventure down that path, right? It's just a cool concept to think about. Lastly, we have the game's ending and the art ending. The game's ending is the longest ending, and this is the ending you get if you continue to defy what the narrator tells you to do. Every single thing he tells you to do, you do the opposite. He tells you to go through the red door, you go through the blue door. Oh, there's also the Zending. The Zending is dumb. I don't even want to really say anything about it. If you go through the red door when he tells you to go through the red... This is if you go down the right and you keep ignoring him, and then you walk through the red door. Right, so the red door... if you walk through the red door, you will enter the Zending, where you enter this room where basically nothing happens. You're just sort of in Zen, and you're just supposed to, again, sit there and do nothing. The narrator tells you to actually sit there, and the only way to escape it is to go down this alternate path where you walk up a staircase and fall off and kill yourself, and thus have to restart. This ending was in the original mod, I know, and as far as I can tell, it's pretty, like, pointless. I don't think there's any interesting message to make with this ending. It's just like, again, it's one of those things where in the game, if doing what the game wants you, the narrator wants you to do, is not actually progressing through the game. Progressing through the game is restarting it, or progressing through the game is killing yourself, thus restarting it. In terms of, like, messages or tropes that are being analyzed here, I mean, this trope has already been sort of discussed with all the different, with all of the different Easter eggs, so I don't think that you not moving through the game counting as progress itself subversion of a standard trope, because in games we're sort of taught to think that it's about moving through the game, it's about completing, it's about progress, right? Well, what about if you just stand still? What if that's also part of the game, right? That's already been done in this game to death. The Zending, I think, is simply there because it was there within the original source mod. I didn't really like the Zending. It wasn't that interesting. So, yeah. So yeah, the game's ending. I'll actually, you know what? No. I will take small break, then I will talk about the game's ending. And we're back. So the game's ending. The game's ending is the ending you get when you just do everything the opposite of what he says. And it's the longest one because pretty much what happens is the more you do stuff that he doesn't want, that the narrator doesn't want, is he'll say, you know what, you don't like the game I've made for you? Screw it, let me give you another game to play if you want to play another game. And you get teleported to Minecraft all of a sudden. And you play Minecraft with him. He's like, oh, you want to play Minecraft? Let's play Minecraft. Then you don't like Minecraft? Let's go play Portal. And if you go through Portal, then he just goes away. And you're actually teleported to the beginning of the original source mod of Stanley Parable. And you walk through some door there and you just fall into nothingness, and that's the end, and you have to restart. The game's ending makes a lot of intuitive sense for this kind of context. If you're making a game about gaming commentary and you're going to have choices, then obviously you need to think about, well, what choice is the choice? You're going to have choice, and you're going to have a narrator who tells the player what choices to make, and if the player constantly makes the opposite choices, what ends up happening? Clearly the narrator doesn't like it, and he transports the player to another game where the player might have more fun, so to speak, because this game obviously ain't doing it for you, right? The game's ending is cool, because there's this moment in the game's ending, once you go through the blue door, where you have this like massive like orange tiles on a room, and the narrator says that, oh yeah, this is an undeveloped part of the game that I haven't finished yet. Which is cool. It's sort of, it hammers in this entire idea where the narrator is like the constructor of the game, and he's working in sort of unconstructed, undeveloped potential game space, story space that he's filling with his ideas. And in it you have this you have this baby game, which is the stupidest thing in the world. He's like, oh, you don't like my game? Well, here's a new game where here's a baby who's crawling towards fire, and you have to press a button to stop it. And of course, if you fail this game, if you don't do what he says, then he transports you to Minecraft and then to Portal. And he makes a joke, if you do this for 4 hours, maybe You know, maybe I'll reward you or something like that. I don't remember the exact line, but the point is the suggestion was that you actually play this ridiculous baby game for 4 hours, and the noise that the machine makes when the baby or the whatever, the fucking thing makes this horrible noise whenever you press the button. And after 2 hours, what happens is another button shows up and there's a dog that's being lowered into water and you need to stop that from happening or some shit like that. And then you have 2 buttons to press. I didn't actually do it. I watched a video of someone doing it on YouTube and they had a macro for it. They weren't actually pressing the buttons or doing this for 4 hours long. Absolutely amazing that they left this in, because they knew people would do this. They knew people would do this ending. And the art ending itself is just like, it's just, there's no narration. There's a white screen with a black slab on it and the writing, I think, from what I recall. It's some reference to 2001 Space Odyssey. That's all I recall about that. Some artistic statement, I guess. Gaming as art, questions, whatever. So those are all the endings, I guess. Yeah. I think I've discussed them all, and I think I've kind of covered the point of these endings. What the point of the game in general is, well, so you have to understand, a game like this, what they're doing is they're taking gaming in general and they're doing commentary on it by having a player character who is faced with various gaming tropes and having a narrator who subverts those tropes. Whenever you make a choice, whenever you fall out of the map, the trope is subverted by a narrator. Whenever you walk out of the boss's office and let the doors close, the trope is subverted by the game in this case, not the narrator. Whenever you stay in a closet for too long, or you know the key code to the boss's office automatically because you've been there before, the narrator subverts the trope. And he does this directly because he can, because the game is self-aware. Because the narrator knows what you, the player, is thinking, because he knows what anyone would be thinking in that situation, right? And at the same time, there's these arcs where the narrator doesn't even subvert the trope. The game itself subverts the trope, and both the character, Stanley, and the narrator are actually part of the trope itself. The game subverts itself to an extent in that phase, like the confusion ending and the narrative contradiction ending subvert the game itself. Whenever you're faced with a choice, if you don't do the choice that the narrator wants, this becomes a trope that he subverts by berating you or by saying how you've somehow ruined the game or you've somehow changed the game by making the choice that you've made. And by leading to stuff like the narrative contradiction ending, the confusion ending, the game's ending, right? So, what is there to say about this game? I mean, it's hard to discuss in a way. You know, it is what it is. There's nothing to compare this game to because no other game does this. You know, it's the Scott McCloud. It's not even a game in a way. It's not a game. Like, the closest thing to compare this to is Dear Esther, but Dear Esther doesn't even try to analyze gaming at all. Dear Esther is just like... Dear Esther is just some fancy dialogue whilst you walk across this island. This game talks about specific things. One thing I would say, though, is that there's flaws. I mean, I guess there's not necessarily flaws, but I feel like there's missed opportunities as to what tropes they could have actually discussed. Like, gaming as a whole, as a genre, as a medium, probably the most trope-filled medium there is, compared to film and compared to books. Definitely compared to books. There's a lot of books out there that really subvert tropes entirely. Like, there's one book, it's on like the top 100 lists of classics. I think it was Virginia Woolf who wrote it, I don't actually remember, but the entire book is just one big sentence. No pauses, no breaks, no punctuation, no paragraphs, none of that shit. One big sentence, right? if you're a book writer, you can always do some weird creative shit like that and subvert all the tropes that exist. With film, tropes being subverted happens pretty often. I mean, you have people like Tarantino that try to subvert tropes. Every once in a while you have really weird abstract movies that sort of subvert tropes. Comic books as well, you have a lot of trope subversion happening in there. You have Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics, where all the tropes are discussed and comics as a genre is thoroughly analyzed. Then you have something like Flex Mentallo, where as a story, everything reality is sort of subverted. In gaming, there's no games that subvert... I mean, there's games that subvert tropes, but just my point is the sheer quantity of tropes is higher, because think about it. You're going to have... What are you going to have? You're going to have playable characters. You're going to have a player character. You're going to have mechanics that work a certain way. The player character is probably going to be very overpowered because they always win. There's always a way out. That's a massive trope. The idea of choice, the idea that choice somehow makes sense and that you come to different stories via the choices you make. I think what's interesting about the narrative contradiction story ending, or the narrative contradiction ending specifically, is it almost suggests that by making a choice different to what the character should have made, it's like time travel almost. It leads to it's like a rip in the fabric of reality, which is how the narrative contradiction ending treats it, because you weren't supposed to make that choice. Stanley wasn't supposed to make that choice. Stanley, the person, wasn't supposed to make that choice. You're nobody. You're a player. You're a player, but in the setting, you're nobody. You're not somebody who's part of the setting, right? Like in the setting, for the setting to make sense, the people in the setting need to be who they are. They need to make the choices who they are because, that universe is deterministic and it follows certain rules. And you, the player, come in and you distort that and it suddenly gets fucked up. That's a trope. Well, it's sort of, that subverts the trope. It examines the trope of the fact that choices in games only make sense because there are players. They don't actually make sense from an in-setting perspective, usually. That's actually one thing that bothers me about certain games with choices, that the idea of having a choice in the game doesn't make any sense. Because this character, I know this character would not have made this would not be an option for them. They would have made one particular choice. Let's see what else. Okay, you have the visual distortions as well, which is a cool thing. A missed opportunity here is, I think, sort of the visual distortion, like the example with the adventure line, where it goes between the lockers, and when it goes between, it looks like a massive hallway. Kind of like that, as well as the stuff where you go out of the map. I'm thinking about visual glitches. One trope in gaming is that everything that you see and interact with is supposed to make sense, right? Everything you see and interact with is supposed to make sense, but this is a game. Imagine a game where, for instance, you see a bug, and that bug isn't actually a bug. That's what's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be a bug. The bug is part of the game. I feel like a Stanley Parable type of approach would have actually made something like that really cool and made light of and subverted that trope appropriately with its own ending, where suddenly like all these visual bugs start happening. Like, imagine for instance that Stanley has to open a door, and the door closes all of a sudden, and he gets stuck in the door, and then the narrator starts saying, wait a second, Stanley, why are you stuck in a door all of a sudden? This isn't supposed to happen, but it's actually part of the game, because one thing that happens in games, specifically source games for that matter, is that you can get stuck within doors a lot. So that would have been hilarious, absolutely hilarious. I think that was a missed opportunity. Right, the mechanics as well, the button pressing. The button pressing thing was only subtle in this game because it was always about Stanley, not about the player character. Although I think the implication was there that the button pressing sort of like gormless, dull thing that Stanley does is in a way what a lot of gamers do, because they play boring games like Call of Duty or whatever over and over and over again, where it's just button pressing over and over again, right? There's no, there's no nuance. But when I'm thinking of button pressing, I'm thinking specifically they could have subverted the trope even more by having this thing where the mechanics suddenly stop functioning or they reverse. For instance, up becomes down or left becomes right. Like the mechanic, like the directions in which you move stop working, and some of the buttons or the buttons you would press on the keyboard work differently or have different effects, and now you have to play the game, or within a certain part of the game or within a certain ending you have to work with this alternate set of mechanics, because the trope here is they're subverting which buttons you actually press, right? So the first person shooter thing they covered with the not seeing your legs and stuff, but they didn't actually talk too much about I mean, there was only a tiny bit about this within the Insanity ending. I feel like this could have had more potential. The actual first-person shooter aspect of so many games, and why it's a first-person shooter game. Like, why is it a first-person shooter perspective for anything? You know, why are you supposed to put yourself within the perspective of this character? What if the camera were somewhere else, for instance, and you had to control the character like that? Well, then it wouldn't be first-person shooter, but it would just, like, it would feel awkward. My point is, the whole point of this game is to subvert tropes, and I'm saying that there's many more tropes that they could have subverted. With first-person shooters especially, a huge thing they could have done is they could have done, like, player character tropes, because this is something they talked about this a little with the explosion ending, with how there's always supposed to be a way out in a game, although that's more of a narrative thing than it is a player character thing. What I'm talking about specifically is how a player character in games is very often overpowered within the setting. Like, the player character is very strong. Even if it's not part of the setting canon, it's obvious that they're super powerful because they kill everything in their path. In first-person shooters, this happens, like in Doom, right? In Doom, you're the only survivor. In Doom 3, you're the only survivor out of this entire Mars base of people. And in so many other games, you are the strongest warrior out of everyone, and there's no explanation for it whatsoever. Some games explain it as, I don't know, you're Kratos, the son of God. Some games explain it like your Commander Shepard. Again, I don't know the reasoning. It depends on game per game, but this is a huge trope. This is a massive trope that didn't really get addressed in this game. This game talked more about narrative tropes. Speaking of which, speaking of narrative tropes, one narrative trope that they didn't actually talk about a lot is how gameplay and story are sometimes integrated. It didn't talk about that at all. What it talked about, I mean, the narrative tropes that happen most often had to do with progression and the fact that choice within a game is taken for granted a lot of the time, even though it doesn't necessarily make sense within the setting, right? Or that the choices you make should in a way that the choices you make should or could lead to a wildly different game than what they actually end up leading to in most games. In most games, choices don't really matter that much. So, you know, there's that. But I'm speaking specifically about how the gameplay of a game can be integrated with the story, right? Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is a great example of a game that does this very well. Integrating gameplay with story is technically its own trope, right? Or at least it's almost starting to become its own trope. You know, sort of moments in games where I'm starting to actually think about sort of parts of games. For instance, quick time events. That's a huge trope. This game never really talked about quick time events. This game never talked about the gameplay story integration thing is QuickTime events are a subset of it. It's when the story of a game only is expressed through the gameplay. Like, the story doesn't progress unless you do something within the game by pressing certain buttons, for instance. That would be a good example. The game didn't really talk about that. So there's a few missed opportunities there I just want to mention. My general feeling about it, though, is that it sort of suggests that a game, because despite me comparing this to Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, there's a huge difference. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics tries to really thoroughly analyze comics and how they work and the tropes and why everything is the way it is and how can it be different. Stanley Parable doesn't really analyze anything. It subverts tropes and it makes fun of them and has witty commentary about them. It doesn't analyze. And that's a huge distinction. This is a short story game. Okay, and with a short story, it's not so much about character or setting or atmosphere or plot or anything as much as it is about the idea itself. This is what this game is. This game is a huge idea. The idea is gaming tropes. How do they work? I'm thinking what would be really cool is a game like Stanley Parable, but that's a lot longer and a lot more thorough. A game that's, you know, a game that's basically a AAA game in terms of its production quality and length. I think there's a lot of merit in that because there's a lot of room for not simply making fun of these tropes, but actually analyzing them and sort of talking about them, you know, explaining to the player where they come from and how to improve them maybe, or how, no, not improve them. Tropes aren't necessarily something that need improvement, but how to perhaps change them, or how to operate outside the tropes, or alternatives that exist. Because gaming has so many fucking tropes, so many tropes, more than any other medium, like I said. Because there's that many variables. There's the visual aspects, there's setting aspects, and there's interactivity aspects to gaming. That, again, Stanley Parable talked more about the narrative. It talked more about the narrative tropes ado with choices in games, not so much mechanics in games. Mechanics is a whole nother area that it could have explored, a lot more, and a long, like, AAA budget, like, real, long story Stanley Parable type game would analyze gaming mechanics and gaming mechanic tropes, as well as other stuff. So, there's huge merit in a game like that. Like, I don't know if there's big demand for it, but I would really like to play a game like that. I think it's really cool. It helps understand gaming. And when I say a game, why the game would have to be longer, because it would actually have to analyze these tropes and not simply do what Stanley does, is just sort of mention them and then move on to the next one. Like, oh look, narrative contradiction. Now let's move on to the game's ending where, you know, you just do what I don't want you to do and I'm going to take you to a new game because, oh, clearly you don't like this game, right? Which isn't really a trope. That's just like a joke that the developers are having with the player. Which some of this game did feel like that. It did feel like there was a joke being had between the developers, between the people who made it and the player, rather than there actually being a message with what was happening. Like, I mean, I like the confusion ending, but that's kind of what the confusion ending was. The confusion ending didn't really have a huge overall message to it. Or the Zending, for instance. Zending didn't have a big message to it. I don't think the confusion ending had a big one either. You could maybe come up with some sort of deep trope subverting aspect to the confusion ending, but I mean, it's late where I am as I'm making this video and I actually can't think of anything off the top of my head other than to say that the confusion ending was about how the writer himself, as they're trying to make a game, they get confused and they start making mistakes, and it's like the adventure line going all over the place and totally screwing up reality, which is really cool. This sort of leads to this like category of what I call gaming theory, or what I'd like to call gaming theory. Not game theory. Game theory is a branch of economics. Gaming theory is a theory about gaming as an art, as in video games as art. Specifically, well, not necessarily video games, but games as art specifically. I think the meaning of the multiple endings within this game has to do with the meaning of multiple endings in games in general, is that multiple endings in games usually just add flavor or they add something to the story. Here, the different endings don't add anything to a story. What they do is they in some cases they add ideas, like they add a different aspect to analyze. Like I said, the narrative contradiction ending talks about what a narrative contradiction is, because you, the player, have created a narrative contradiction because you are not actually Stanley, but you're acting in his shoes. The game's ending is another aspect to gaming where you have basically defied the narrator because you don't like the game, because the idea there is that you don't like the game that he's made for you, so he sets you to a new one. So part of the meaning to the multiple endings is the fact that each ending has sort of its own theme and idea to it. At the same time, some of the endings don't have any idea or theme to them. Like the Zending, I think, doesn't have any real idea to it. Some of the endings are just sort of gimmicky. I'll say that. Some of the endings are gimmicky. The choices are looked at and made fun of. Your choices are made fun of because the game is always sort of having an inside joke with the player, and it makes fun of the choice you make by giving you an alternative where you're going to have to restart the game no matter what. But it's not a real analysis, right? An analysis is complex. An analysis is deep. An analysis is when you're sort of really trying to answer not just the whats, but the whys and the hows and and how can we change it, and how can we operate in a different way, and where does it come from? You know, why does this trope even exist? That's what Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics did, and I just keep coming back to that because it's such a good example of this type of art, the type of fiction where it's not about a particular story, it's about the genre as a whole. So I think what this game should do, again, this whole game is simply a reminder to me. Like short stories in general have inspirational value, as I say. They have inspirational value because they are a reminder of what could be, of what, you know, of what a lengthy and thorough story can accomplish if they adhere to the ideas that are so beautifully put forth in some short stories. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons comes to mind. You know, stuff like Dear Esther comes to mind. A long story game, its job, its artistic purpose, the way I see it, is to take the ideas of a short story, refine them, no, not refine them necessarily, take the ideas presented in the short story that are in their sort of pure, refined form, and construct an actual setting and a plot around it and characters around the idea so that we feel it more, so that it appeals to our emotions and our sense of, as well as our intellects, in a sort of long, elaborate plot, right? In the case of this, you wouldn't have a long, elaborate plot, but you would have a long, elaborate sort of analysis. The entire game could be looked like an analysis. And by the way, when I'm talking about the sort of hypothetical idea of a long, sort of a long Stanley Parable game that truly analyzes all these tropes, I don't mean that in analyzing tropes the narrator just chats or that you're just given text on the screen. No, that's telling, not showing. They can do the whole thing that they do within this game, which is show you all these cool visual things, and the point is, I mean, there's different ways to express something to a person. Especially since we're dealing with video games, what they could do is demonstrate the trope to you by giving you the trope within one of the paths within the story, one of the endings, one of the arcs. They can give you the trope that arc is supposed to, that ending, that path, that branch is supposed to analyze. They can give you that trope, and sort of the point of the path, the point of the branch, is to go into more detail and look at that trope in different situations and maybe even other games, and to look at how, to get a better sense of what that trope actually means and where it comes from and what it actually is. Yeah, that's how I see it. it's weird. I haven't actually thought too much about what my like Stanley Parable long story game would look like, but I would have to think about that to give a fully detailed answer. My point is, this game is fantastic because of the potential that it sort of faces, because of all the ideas that it brings up. And it brings up a ton of fucking ideas. Many more ideas than most games, even more short games. Yeah. It's not the best short game, though. I would say that Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is better. And it's better because it doesn't... because it does more than just bring forth ideas through narration, and because there's not much gameplay in Stanley, right? There's mostly narration, and it's mostly narration and the exploration that where the ideas come from. In Brothers, the ideas come from the story itself, and there is an actual emotional aspect to it as well. I mean, I don't think... Actually, I don't really know how audiences would react, but I feel like putting those two, comparing those two is easy victory for Brothers, if you ask me. It's a very different kind of game, too, so people would think, well, why are you comparing those two? Those are completely different kinds of games. No, but in terms of quality, like, in terms of how much I enjoyed them, in terms of how good they were, in terms of how good I think they were, I thought Brothers was better, because... You know, Stanley Parable it shined the light on a lot of stuff that gaming does, but it didn't bring up anything that important, right? It didn't have its own sort of message. It was just like, hey, look at all these gaming tropes. These are funny, right? Right? Whereas Brothers had an actual firm opinion. It's like, here's this thing that we're going to do. Here's this, the Brothers almost created a trope of its own, I think. Like, here's the thing that we're going to do, and we have a statement and a theme, and this gameplay integrated with story thing going on, and it was just elegant and beautiful and constructed and perfectly weighed, so as to the fact that every aspect of the game appealed to this one idea. You know, Stanley, as cool as it is, and it's a cool idea, it's a fundamentally very, very cool idea, it's sort of all over the place. I'll say that. Some parts of this game, it feels like it's kind of all over the place. And that's its really one flaw. And the fact that there's some missed opportunities, I'd say. But more so the fact that it's all over the place. Again, like, I could bring up the Zending and the Insanity ending and say, well, what is the point of these endings? What are you trying to say about gaming? And it's, if you think about it, it's not about trying to say anything particular about gaming. It's just about trying to... It's just about the experience of it. Just the experience of being Stanley, going through the insane ending and thinking... what does it make you think about the genre as a whole as you go through this? It's not about a particular trope or a particular idea per se, right? So that's my point. It just, there's that tiny aspect of it that's kind of disorganized, thematically. That is, that's what I would say about it. But in terms of what this game brings forth to the genre, sorry, to the medium, is it brings a lot, I'd say, because Stanley Parable, it really gets players to question, it really opens up the world to this whole metagaming aspect. A game about a game, right? It opens us up to that entire universe of that kind of game and that kind of content and this kind of analysis where we look at the tropes and try to subvert them and try to make fun of them and try to analyze them, perhaps. So it has a lot of potential, I'd say. Very good game. It's definitely a top 10 kind of game. It's definitely unique enough and powerful enough to be a top 10 kind of game. It's also a kind of game that you would really want to watch other people play and to see their reaction, right? Number one, though, Brothers: Tale of Two Sons, still, for that end. For last year. This is pretty old stuff, but I'm just talking about it now because it came to mind, right? Anyway, yeah, I guess that's about it. I feel like, yeah, I feel like I'm probably done talking about this topic, but I feel like Stanley Parable has warranted enough discussion that I would, uh, that it would influence some of the ideas I have about gaming and some of my thoughts going forward, and I might think about it and harken back to it uh, when developing these new ideas. Right, Brothers is sort of Brothers as well, it goes into that category, but Stanley more so because Stanley sort of undermines the genre completely, whereas Brothers just focuses on one part, right? Anyway, so that's about that. I'm gonna head off now. Thank you for watching. GG all.